Yeah, thanks, Warren. Yes, thank you, Eric, for, you'll be speaking a little bit later about the proposed police reform. But I know when, in the conversations that we've had with Menomonie Cares, with bringing Chief Atkinson in, just looking at all of the different policies that are going on, for the city, trying to look at what could we do better as a community, and vice versa, the police department, what they can do better. And so even just looking at some of the, I guess some people might think, a website is something small and not a big thing, but having transparency, showing some equity and diversity and inclusion in the site, how do you report a complaint? Those are some things that, that had kind of stemmed from those conversations. So, I know, Chief Atkinson was like reaching out because I had made some statements and comments about like, how can we be better, even just the transparency for the police department. And so we met virtually and really kind of discuss some of those items. And so I know even just today, I'm like, I hadn't looked in a while to see like coming soon, all these different, where those pages were before. And so we're hoping to, see some changes in that respect of like, from what the community is getting for information, to what is a complaint? What does that mean? Eric, I know, you took a lot of precocious notes, I'm sure, because there's a lot to share. But we're hoping that maybe, from that conversation, it stemmed to a bit better transparency. And so I'm looking forward to see some of those changes. And, you're gonna be talking about reform, but it's like, even how do we reform the image of the police department? There's a theory about image restoration. Like, how do you do that when, George Floyd's murder really has made everybody more aware of like, what is our police department doing? So it'd just be great to kind of hear both what the reform for the state is, to then to see what is it going to be like here in Menomonie. So, Eric.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for that conversation. So we're moving a little bit at the speed of government here with the website development, but what that really means is that we're being very deliberate with some of those changes. Like some of the things that came up were about accessibility for complaints, what information is happening, what kind of programs are taking place, what is the police department doing for the community, how are we interacting. So if you go to that website, it'll say coming soon. So we've taken that down and have been completely, deconstructing it, so to speak, and then rebuilding that. Myself and Brenna Jasper, who most of you probably know who she is or have met her through some type of meeting. We're working to add those pieces in there. So one, it's easier to see when you get on the landing page. And I think that was an issue right up front because you only had a couple selections. And when you went into the selections, you had to kind of know where to navigate or maybe understand probably some policing vernacular as to how we would call it. And then it made it difficult to navigate. And when you folks first invited me and started talking about it, and then the subsequent conversation with Vickie, I became very aware of it, and I could see that would be a challenge. So I'm hoping when we get this thing put back out, we can bring it back, have the group take a look at it if you're interested and willing to, and see if it's easier to navigate. And part of that is too kind of the reimaging, rebranding, to show what it is that we do here that separates us from others and how we're serving you. And I think the product will be better, but of course, everything requires feedback, or I'm going to ask for it anyway. And I hope you're willing to share that in the future, if that's okay.
Thank you, Vickie. Thank you, Eric, both of you. It's really wonderful. everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. This is no small thing, no small matter. Thank you.
Right. So if you want to dive in, I can kind of give, we got some time yet for the state speakers task force. So I think most of you received a copy of it or had access to it. I sent one out. Overall, I think the recommendations are really good. I think that they do provide some good guidance for law enforcement and for departments. I have some apprehension, though, that in this sense that they are good, they're good suggestions, but I worry that people will think that it'll be all changing kind of thing, that that our expectations might be too high. And part of the reason why I say that before I kind of go into some of the individual ones is that a lot of this stuff is centered around what you can't do, you know, the shalls and shall nots, which is okay. You need to have those things. But when I believe when you're talking about like equality, equity, disparate outcomes, those sorts of things, it's a much bigger picture. And that requires some significant change. And it's difficult to do that in the United States because we're a republic and you have 50 different states with 50 different sets of laws. And each community is not equal in the sense of funding or expectations too, which presents some significant challenges. But I'll jump into the speakers task force, and then I have the world according to Eric reform, which I'll go through. If I could make changes on my own, I would, what I would do or recommend. Well, anyway, just kind of touching in there, they talk about use of force by law enforcement and duty to report and intervene. Absolutely a great one. Watching the George Floyd, there was plenty of opportunity for those other officers to step in and stop it, and they didn't do it. And so not only do I think that that's a good requirement to have in law, and I think you could apply certainly our misconduct in office to it, because most policies in departments will have some kind of duty to intervene or prevention of excessive force. But having it specifically laid out, nothing wrong with it. Where I'm hoping the task force will go into, and they didn't really talk about that, is that needs to be reinforced with police training. And what do I mean by that is literally when we are practicing our police training or being taught it, you have to set up scenarios where there is excessive force or it's taking place and you're teaching people how to intervene and tap out, and that's okay, to stop it, to make sure it doesn't happen. So it needs to be something practiced and reinforced, not just put into black and white in the law, but it has to become part of what you learn and what you do. The old saying is, what is it? Monkey see, monkey do. We learn from each other, and if we're not practicing it, we just might not do it. And we're trying to prevent things like what happened to George Floyd. Whistleblower protections. We already have similar ones like that on the books, but enhancing that, nothing wrong with that. And it should be there. And no officer should be retaliated for it. But has there been officers that have had retaliation against them? Oh yeah, for sure. And to have something like that in place, I think is just, it has this kind of a reinforcement that you can speak up. You can say something to intervene if something is happening, or if you've learned of something that shouldn't have happened, you can say something to protect it. One of the nice pieces about Wisconsin, which some states don't have, is we have a police and fire commission, and there are certain, it's kind of lack of a better term, police officer bill of rights, which does protect us from retaliatory action. So if, let's say I was a bad chief and someone had reported something and I didn't like it because maybe it made me look bad or something's happening, and I try to discipline or terminate the person, it'll come back on me. And the police and fire commission, or I don't have the power to just terminate somebody or just to suspend somebody. There's a civilian review board that gets to have that say on it. So those are those protections. And then there's also, I can be sued too. So there's always that. And if you've ever been sued, it's not fun. I'm just going to let you in on that. So chokeholds on officers. To me, I find it very unusual that there are still departments that teach what would be considered a chokehold or a carotid control hold. So to get rid of those, I think is just fine. If there's a case where your life is in danger, and so like your last resort, it's like a true deadly force, then I think it's okay. But to be teaching that, and we do not in Wisconsin, so you don't see, that's why you don't see those kind of choke outs or sleeper holds taking place around here, which I'm very thankful for. Public access to use of force policies, to me, that's a no-brainer. I think if you want access to any policy, the public should have it. And they do, really, from our Chapter 19 is our open records law in Wisconsin. And Wisconsin has probably one of the most liberal open records laws available. It's considered a sunshine state, which means that for me to not release a record to you, I need to have a very, very good reason. And then you also have recourse or redress where you can basically file what's called a mandamus to get it. And I have to have a hearing that proves why I can't give it to you. And if you prove that I should have gave it to you, not only do I got to give it to you, but then I got to pay your attorney fees too. So there are a lot of things in there to try to protect the public. Statewide standard use of force, we already have that, which is fine to do that. I think what they're more getting at is some of maybe the definitions and how that works. So we have a law enforcement standards board, which is statutorily empowered, and they help create that standardized training for use of force. The problem that occurs is that once you get out of the academy, or if you're in a local one, like let's say you're in a large enough department that has its own, then you may not receive a lot of training after that. Yes, you have to have 24 hours of in-service training a year to maintain your license, but that doesn't mean you're receiving that use of force training. So that's a challenge. Transparency, oversight, independence, use of use of force review advisory boards. It depends upon what powers the boards have, I would say. I don't think there's any issues with having outside people taking a look at use of force. You have the Police and Fire Commission that's already statutorily empowered. And if people want to have, like, let's say a third party reviewer looking at officer involved critical incidents, like either a death, serious accident or injury, I think that's a wise idea. The FAA does those things when they have crashes and dissect it. And our state did put in for having for officer involved deaths, serious injuries, I think would be certainly something to put into as well. So I don't see any issues with having advisory boards or seeing what that looks like. Again, it just depends on the rules and make sure it doesn't conflict with Police and Fire Commission statutes. Let's see here. One more thing about the advisory boards. You'll see a lot of this nationally where people are talking about creating these advisory boards or reviewing, let's say, disciplinary actions. So if a use of force was done and then a chief goes to suspend or terminate, and then you're finding that the board is actually overturning it and returning the person back to work, either in arbitration through like a union grievance or through one of these advisory boards. One of the problems with the advisory boards is they tend to overturn the punishments of the police departments. So like the administrations. And part of that is the same reason why I think you'll see in juries where they don't always want to convict people for serious offenses. And part of that is because it's a person and you're voting to either take away their job or send them to prison or whatnot. And you have some of that human factor on it. So those are some challenges that take place in that, and where some chiefs who are not in Wisconsin, who have some of those like arbitration type boards, have issues with that. And then body cameras. I think when people saw the body cameras coming out, they thought that was going to be a real game changer. It was in some regards because it ended up helping overturn a lot of false type complaints. I don't think it's necessarily going to stop something like the George Floyd that, as you saw, even though the main video was from a cell phone camera, The other officers had body cameras, and that's not necessarily going to stop it. I think body cameras are great to have. They're great tools and evidence. I think they did help convict Derek Chauvin, and I think the other officers will help their convictions too as well. So they'll end up going to prison. And that's going to go into more of what if the world was according to Eric, where I think reform would help. But body cameras are a help, and strong supporter of them. Yes, Ms. Remund.
Just a quick question, because I seem to keep reading articles where they'll say, you know, that the officer's camera wasn't activated, so there's no body camera footage for X, Y, or Z situation. How often does that happen? Is that just am I just perceiving this because of related to media coverage, or are there issues with deactivation of body cameras?
Well, I'm gonna ride the fence. I'm gonna sound a bit like a politician here. I think it's both real and perceived. So of course, anytime we read about stuff or articles, I mean, we'll see it and it changes our thoughts for good or for the better. Problem that has happened in some departments, it depends on the policy that a department may have about when you can have the camera on, when you can't have the camera on, how is the camera activated, at what situation should you have it activated. Now, a lot of people, and I would lump myself into this group, is that if you're going to be involved in any potential as a patrol officer, as an enforcement action, an investigation, like we would call it a field interview or a reasonable suspicion stop. If you're doing those kinds of activities, that camera should be on. If you're going to a call for service, like I'm going to domestic violence complaint, theft complaint, you know, whatever, that should be on. When it shouldn't be on is if you're not doing like police activity. So if you're in the bathroom, maybe you're on general patrol.
If you're having coffee at the donut shop.
Yeah, and I like my coffee, and I like my donuts too, as you can tell. I got the physique that shows it. So yeah, for those things, you don't need to have it on 24 hours a day. But when you are engaging in the work, yeah, have it on. And so for context wise, 23 years ago when I became a police officer and squad cameras were becoming kind of a thing, there's a lot of suspicions like, oh, this is a big brother watching me. But then people got used to it. They liked it. It worked out. Now, for a lot of departments that don't have the cameras, because there is a significant expense to it, the officers want the cameras because more often than not, our squad cameras and body cameras have helped overturn complaints, helped us in court. And so, and it shows that you're doing what you're supposed to do. And frankly, if you are an ethical police officer and you're caring for the community, you should have no problem with it. You really shouldn't. And if you are, it kind of makes me wonder why? What are you doing that you don't want people to see? I mean, really, when you think about it. So
right. Or in the case of Chauvin and company, how did they not think that those were going to be problematic things to have on record?
See, now we're getting to the real reasons for reform and where it is, because when certain things are taking place, you're not thinking about a camera. You're not thinking about some of this other stuff. And that's where I'm going to get at. Because like this stuff with the body cams and what the state is talking about here, they're kind of these Band-Aid pieces. I don't think it's going to get to the real issue at heart. I really don't. And I think in America, we kind of look for fast solutions. We're kind of instant gratification. We're a fast food nation. We want our internet to be moving like this. We want things to happen. That's why I say don't get your expectations up, because I don't think we're really addressing the real problem. Parts of it, puzzle pieces, but we should look at the whole puzzle. So to move on, to speed up, to get to the good stuff, no-knock search warrants. I think at times that judges have been too loose on approving some of them and to use no-knock search warrants. I've been part of them before, but they were rare. It seems like it's becoming more common. So tracking the no-knock search warrants, making sure that there is a true viability for them, I think you need to have that. And yes,
No,
Marion.
yes, thanks, Eric. But just to say that I think you didn't speak to the statewide collection of data on use of force.
Oh, yes, I would say that it would be appropriate to do a statewide collection on use of force. Thank you for redirecting. That's a good thing to do. I think you have to identify what levels of use of force do you want to take, because taking someone in handcuffs is the type of use of force. Do we want to track every time we put bracelets on somebody? Or do we want to start tracking? Are we only going to be tracking when we put someone in like it's called a come along technique? I would grab hold of someone's arm who is not wanting to go. Is that where we're going to start the tracking? You're going to want to have a universal setup for that. And there are some concerns, I think, about cost of that. I don't think it's that big of a deal. And I think it should be reported, so communities know what kind of force is being used. Plus, it's like if you have, let's say, 50 officers in a department, and you had maybe 100 use of force incidents that were above a come along technique, let's say that, and Officer Joe had 75 of the 100, that should start telling you something. Either this person doesn't know how to talk to people, or they're being just excessively jumping to it, or a combination of the both. It's a competency issue. It might even be a mental issue up here too. So that's why I think tracking use of force is important. Plus, it's also important to know how often it really does happen. Because I think people right now are thinking, oh, this is just happening all the time. In reality, it's not. But it doesn't matter, because that's what people are seeing. And they are going to with cameras and other stuff like that. And it gets replayed. So it is good to track it. It gives us a better perspective. Employment files of law enforcement officers. This is part of the Eric Large reform piece. Good background checks, access to these personnel files to make sure they're not scrubbed clean, like leaving in lieu of termination or those sorts of things. Being truth and disclosure. And also making sure those who are doing these background checks know how to do them. And the problem is we have 480 some departments here in Wisconsin of local law enforcement, 72 sheriff's offices. Not all of them have the same resources as others to do quality background checks, to do screening things like psychological examinations. I mean, psychological examinations were recommended for law enforcement back in the 1930s. And we still have many states, including this one, that don't mandate them. So that's a challenge right there. And we should be doing psychological exams. My department does them. I'm glad our city supports the finances for that. They've never had an issue with it, but that needs to be done. Drug testing. We have to have drug testing for a person that's hired. And I think we should have them too during critical incidents. And most agencies or most departments are encouraging, hey, you need to get it, or either mandating it, or officers, if they don't mandate it, want it done to try to prove that they're okay, that they're not drunk, they're not on drugs, they're not on one of the 7 major panels like amphetamines and THC. But it doesn't test if you're on antidepressants. That used to be a concern of folks, that if they were, well, they get depressed, they get PTSD and things like that, and they seek therapy and treatment, that would show up, and that doesn't. But they need to have drug testing. Another great recommendation. Psychological examinations. By the way, going back to psych tests and these other things, where I see one of the hurdles to this is that it's the money issue going to be, again, because we're talking psychological examinations are anywhere from $350 to $1,000. And depending on the department, for the size, the turnover, that has an impact. The other part is too, is the psychologist really aware of what are the rigors of law enforcement? And what I say by that is like the constant negativity, the trauma. Is this person going to be susceptible to what I would, to steal something from Star Wars, go to the dark side? They're going to all of a sudden become bitter, cynical, negative, dehumanizing others, which, by the way, is what I would say the Derek Chauvin case. What you saw in the eyes, He wasn't looking at him as a person. He was looking at him as an object. And that kind of goes into the big scheme of things.
He almost looked dissociated to me.
Oh, absolutely.
Like he wasn't there.
Yeah, I'd be willing to bet, and I don't know him or his history. There's no way he is the same person when he was hired as he is now. I mean, he would still have some basic psych tenets, but I am sure his mentality had drastically changed over the years in his approach to people and things. I'd be willing to bet that. I could be wrong, and I've been wrong before, and I'll be wrong again. But I would think that over time, things happened. School resource officers having that kind of training, oh, that's an absolute must. A school police officer has more police authority than I do. And what do I mean by that? In order for me to search somebody, I have to have probable cause. A school resource officer has to have what's called reasonable suspicion, a much lower burden of proof. And to kind of give you a definition, like probable cause would be like, you probably have something on you that you're not supposed to have, and boom, 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 here are all the reasons why. Reasonable suspicion could be, well, you've entered a school, we had a tip from a person that said that they're bringing in drugs or a gun or something along those lines, and this person has had problems before. That would be more of a reasonable suspicion where I can stop and detain someone temporarily and be able to then, but they can do a search with the school, because the school has the authority to search all property that's in there. If I come onto the school grounds, I don't have that authority. But if I'm a school resource officer who spends my time there as a part school official, they have that authority. And to understand what those differences are, and also how to not abuse those differences, because that can be abused. And then to also understand the psychology of children and adolescents, how it impacts delinquency. Mm-hmm. Because your brain really doesn't start developing until about 24, 25 years old. Understanding circumstances and repercussions of actions. I'm not saying you can't hold kids accountable. I'm just saying that needs to be a factor in enforcement decisions. Crisis intervention training. We've got our officers trained in it, and it has made a world of difference. It's a spendy training program. It's not unusual for it to run $1,000 a person. That is very cost prohibitive. So I would encourage anybody to get it. But if the state is going to mandate it, or let's say the country is going to try to make it federally mandated, they're going to need to find funding for it. And it's going to be costly. But it works. It really does. It's good stuff. Decertification of bad law enforcement officers. Thank you. Yes, please. Community engagement grant programs. Yeah, I read that. Yeah, we need to have those. I would say, though, the problem with grants, at least in my experience, a lot of them are focused into very major cities. And I get it. They have a lot of issues and unique things. Local communities need that too, for paying for training and specialized services. And I received an email here just recently that there is a deficit in the state training that is aid that comes to local departments. It is in jeopardy. So we're talking about national reform or state police reform, and already you're talking about cuts to training. How are we going to reform people if we can't train them on what the reforms are? How are we going to get a reform if you can't do this? It's like the Pink Floyd song. How are you going to have your pudding if you don't eat your meat? It's just, anyway, I'm a Pink Floyd fan, so I'll just put that out there. Crisis response teams, another great one. We're working on developing several collaborative response teams here in Dunn County, and we have some hybrids right now. But again, it comes down to resources. It's not always popular to spend a lot of money on like human services and social services type projects. And that's where a lot of this funding needs to go to. You've seen lots of cuts in education and social services over the years. We need to restore that, because that's the kind of help police need, because when they cut that funding, who are they now sending for those types of things? The cops. We're not always the best option for that. And I think everybody would agree to that. Last thing, unnecessarily summoning an officer. Yeah, it's okay, but I think that needs clarification on here. We don't see a whole lot of that kind of false complaints. I get what they're getting at, though, about people calling in saying, well, there's a suspicious person just because they're Black or a person of color. And we already have that as obstruction. I think you just need to have the district attorneys and the officers feel empowered to enforce that. So whether or not you change a statute to have it specifically written for that, that's one thing, or we can utilize statutes that are already in place. And then lastly, qualified immunity, to be quick on that, because that's a complicated subject. It is not a law. It is a judicial doctrine that was created first in the 60s, but then re-enhanced around 1982. There are good and bad parts about the qualified immunity, and here's what it was put in, what it should be. To protect people from frivolous lawsuits when they're doing their duty. That is what it should be. And where it has gone wrong is that, and this is a federal thing, by the way, the states have indemnity, which is kind of similar, but on the federal qualified immunity, this is where lawyers and judges have kind of placed it. There's a part in that qualified immunity that says in order for you to not have qualified immunity, it has to be in violation of a clearly established practice. Like, this has happened and we know this is bad. Well, in 1982, did they have tasers? No. In 1982, did they have 3/4 of the tools and things that we have right now? No. No, they didn't. But unless it's clearly defined, and they're taking clearly established to mean as that so narrowly in focus, well, this didn't happen this way because there is no case law about that taser. Well, wait a minute. If the incident says, I mean, you look at this and go, this is clearly excessive force, just because there wasn't that thing to even exist back then. It's been twisted. And so what I would encourage, and I'm sure there'll probably be some sort of change on the federal level. I don't think you're going to avoid it. But what I would encourage the courts, and this is where the judges come in, is that saying, look, clearly established to me should mean that's a clear Fourth Amendment violation. That would be an unlawful seizure of a person, because this is really what a lot of this stuff centers around. Deadly force is a seizure of a person. Handcuffing is a seizure of a person. So if it's doing something like if I just shot somebody and I had no reason, that's a Fourth Amendment violation. I should not have to prove that all the same circumstances happened here as it did back then. And that's why people are aggravated about qualified immunity. And they have some just cause for that. Because to me, at least in my opinion, I believe qualified immunity is a good thing. I think it's been applied unfairly, though. Because if I do some of these things that some of these other folks have done, I would expect to be sued. And that's what this is a civil forfeiture. It has nothing to do with being charged criminally. That does not protect you from criminal charges. So that I would ask judges to change. And you know what? It'll probably get changed through legislation at some point. So if you're acting outside the color of law, which is really what it should be, yeah, you can expect to get sued. You probably should get prosecuted too. So anyway, now we're at 24 after. I'm going to give you the 1-minute elevator speech of why, of what the real reform should be. It has to do with who you're recruiting. It has to do with how you're hiring, what kind of people you're looking for, doing those psychologicals, doing the background checks, changing the way policing training is occurring, not just at the front end, but throughout their entire careers, about putting the value of life as number one. That has to be first and foremost. You are a community caretaker and keeper. You are there to provide aid. You need to look at adjusting the way you solve crime and working with people on much more of a public health type standard. Looking at do no harm, looking at the root causes of problems, not dehumanizing others, not creating this us versus them. There are going to be times where you're going to have to use force or you have to arrest somebody. I think everybody gets that, but that can't be your primary focus up front where you're paranoid thinking that everybody is out to get you. That is not the case. It is, and it's going to take that upfront part on hiring, upfront on training. It's going to take the leadership of not just law enforcement, but your mayors, your managers, your council members, your congressmen, women. They have to buy into that. And where the obstacles are going to be is people are very fractured. People have different expectations. And it's going to be very challenging because we're 50 different states and we have all these communities in them. Generational turnover helps. I'm going to be very blunt on that from Kathleen. Some of that does help and some people just need to get out of the way. And I'm sure there'll be people maybe that listen to this call will get mad at that statement, but it is true. When the Ferguson incident happened, there were those of us that thought that this is going to motivate people to do some changing and to embrace and do things differently. President Obama, like him or not, I think the best thing he did, or one of the best things he did, was having the president's task force on policing. I would encourage any of you to read it. Those departments that did implement those practices have fared much better. Those that put up the brakes on it because they were so into tradition or just didn't like him or who knows, all the way to they didn't like him because of his color. I'm sure that happens too. That document, if you follow it, you're going to do well. But a lot of folks didn't like it. But now you're seeing many more departments after those leaders have gone. Some of those folks that were entrenched are gone. Many more have embraced that style. It's challenging though, because it takes time to change. It's getting better. So to go with it, yeah, some of it is generational. You need some folks to just retire or go away or leave. And that takes some leadership too, because some of those, you need to help them find the door. You're you're impeding progress. You're obstructing change. And so that's my kind of 1 to 2 minute elevator speech on some of the stuff. The things Speaker Task Force did, yeah, they got some good suggestions. But you need a holistic change. Very much so. Doing evidence-based practices, problem-oriented policing, which is really public health, taking public health strategies to address crime and disorder. Community-oriented policing, which is working with a community to solve problems together, not just police dictating what's going to happen. And that comes to a larger prospect, is essentially creating a contract with your community. How do you want to be policed? What do you want from us? And I don't know if, I don't feel like that takes place in a lot of places, and all those shareholders are not necessarily at the table. I know we're getting to the end of our time and I got a 1:30 appointment too. So I'm hoping I can wrap up this and then take a question or two if you have it. I'm going to share with you folks, sent to Warren or Marion. It's called Sir Robert Peel's Principles of Law Enforcement. They were published in 1829 during the London Metropolitan Policing Act. I would encourage you to take a look at that, because that's really what policing should be. And they had it. It really, it's not, this stuff we're talking about is not a new concept. It just hasn't been put into practice for a lot of different reasons. Some of it out of greed, political power, or some racist stuff. I mean, let's face it, some of those things have impacted it. I'm going to share it with the group. I would encourage you to read it if you get a chance. It's good stuff. Anyway, any questions or comments? I know I crammed a lot of stuff in there. No, you're tired of me. All right.
Oh, I was just waiting for somebody. Eric, we're so, okay. I mean, yeah, thank you for a really lively and vibrant reflection on these recommendations. I mean, I think we probably all do have some questions about how it's affecting our community. And I know that you've already shared with, I mean, maybe I'm speaking for others as I say this. I know that's something that perhaps in the future we can understand. I mean, I don't know if we're going to do some advocacy or write on this. I mean, you mentioned some things about need for funding. That's always really a great thing to write about. You know, when you talked about some of the positive initiatives that are going on here that are going to fall away if the force doesn't have the funding. So that's one thing I heard. So maybe people can kind of gather their thoughts about how we can create a response to this, to some of these recommendations, and something that would be supportive of the many positive initiatives that are part of the Menomonie Police Department, right?
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about any of those at some time.
Yeah, so that's one quick response from me. Does anyone else have and of course, our incredible gratitude to be able to sit in on a conversation like this. It's just really very valuable, and we value you for what you're doing for our community.
Thank you. I value you folks. That's why I do it.
Yeah,
and enjoy it.
And to hear about how Vickie was able to have this really open conversation with you. I know when you first came to our meetings, you said you can tell me things that you can make criticism. I think you said you had your big boy pants on. And,
yes, I do.
So that is how we get to move forward together, is by being able to honestly express our concerns and to get good feedback. So I'm just blithering on. I know you got to go. Anybody else? Vickie, anybody?
Oh no, I just really appreciate Chief Atkinson to kind of share with us that document of what's happening at the state level, but I would definitely be interested in finding out how does that parallel to what you'll be doing for the city.
Absolutely, be happy to share.
Well,
and I just wanted to say thank you, honestly, because it really does come from the top down, and it shows, because I work really closely with a lot of different officers in your department, and some of them are just so phenomenal that I hear about it from my clients, and it makes me super happy. But it really shows, and also on a personal level, that I know that you advocate for your team. And to me, that's amazing, because I know that there have been people in certain situations that you have advocated for and stood your ground. And I know that's not always easy to do. And I really appreciate that, just coming from a personal level, because when I hear things like that, that makes me really happy as, an advocate, that I know you take care of your people. So thank you. Well,
I do my best. If there the changes we have made, at least in the time I've worked here, they've been challenging, and I feel strongly that if they're going to that effort and trying to do what's right for people, yes, I'll stand up for them. And if people are not interested in putting the community's best interests first, they know where they stand with me as well, because we're public servants first and foremost, and that's what we should be. And sometimes it results in tough conversations, and we've had changes, and that's okay. And that's required us to have changes in personnel and whatnot, and that's fine. So I appreciate you saying that, Angie. Thank you very much for sharing that.
Wonderful.
I'm over here like crying like a dummy.
Well, it's been a tough year.
Yeah.
It just has, for everyone.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That I value this group and our coming together, and maybe on June, we may be closing down for the summer. However, Eric, if you're available on June 8th, we could really finish the conversation and have some additional response to this. Okay. And
absolutely. I'm I'll look at my calendar real quick here so I can just see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll be in the office and available. So
okay, great. So we'll be continuing this initial conversation then, maybe with some questions about the recommendations themselves, and also, as I think some people related to how this affects Menomonie policing. And okay, great.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Great. We'll
Thank you.
Bye.
So much.
Take care. Have a good Memorial weekend.
Thank you so
As
much.
well.
Bye-bye.